In this building, your job is to stay invisible. Now, get your filthy mop out of here. You're fired. Walter Gaines had cleaned Caldwell Tower for 7 years. He never missed a day. He never complained. He was the man who kept the lights on, and the man the CEO treated like a stain on the marble floor. But Derek Holloway made one fatal mistake. He thought he was firing a nobody. He didn't realize that the man he just humiliated was the reason his paycheck cleared every month. But just before we see the moment this CEO's world falls apart, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you're finding value in these stories of justice, make sure you're subscribed. Tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Now, let's get back to the building. The elevator doors opened at 5:47 in the morning and nobody was watching. That was fine with Walter Gaines. He pushed his cart out slowly, the wheels making a soft sound against the marble floor. The lobby of Caldwell Tower was empty at this hour, just light and glass and the faint hum of the ventilation system. Walter liked it this way. Before the suits arrived, before the noise, before the eyes that looked through him like he was furniture. He set the cart near the front desk and began his first round. Trash cans, entry glass, the long reception counter that always had fingerprints by the end of the previous day. Walter worked without hurrying. He had learned a long time ago that a man who rushed made mistakes, and mistakes in this building got noticed fast. His hands were weathered. His uniform was clean but faded at the collar. His work boots had been resoled twice, and still they fit better than anything new. He was 63 years old and had worked the early shift at Caldwell Tower for 7 years without missing a single day except once, when his wife passed, and even then he came back the following Monday because staying home made the silence worse. People assumed things about a man pushing a mop. Walter had stopped explaining himself a long time ago. By 6:30, the building began to wake. Security guards changed shifts. The coffee cart arrived in the lobby. Elevators started dinging. And with every new face that walked through the revolving doors, the air changed a little, became faster, sharper, more important. Walter moved out of the way. He always moved out of the way. A young woman in a blazer walked past him without looking. Two men argued about a meeting time, stepping around his cart like it was a pothole. A delivery guy asked him where the loading dock was, and Walter told him politely, pointing down the hall, and the man said thanks and left without ever seeing his face. Walter finished the lobby and moved toward the elevators. He pressed the button for the third floor, offices, conference rooms, long stretches of carpet that needed attention. The elevator opened. A man in his 40s stepped out quickly, nearly walking into the cart. "Watch it," the man said. Walter stepped back. "Sorry, sir." The man glanced at him once, not at his face, at his uniform, then walked on. Walter got in the elevator. The doors closed. He looked at himself in the mirror on the elevator wall. An old man in a faded uniform, hands wrapped around a mop cart, jaw set quiet and steady. He looked like someone who had learned to disappear on purpose. The third floor was empty. Walter worked in silence. He moved methodically, desk to desk, corner to corner. He straightened chairs people had left crooked. He wiped coffee rings off surfaces without being asked. He replaced the paper towels in the bathroom before they ran out because he had memorized the rhythms of this building the way a sailor memorizes the sea. At 7:52, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Fast ones. A man entered the office area without knocking. He was younger than Walter by at least 20 years, broad in the shoulders, wearing a charcoal suit that fit like it had been built around him. His name was Derek Holloway. Walter knew him. Most of the building knew him. Holloway had been promoted to Chief Operations Officer 8 months ago, and since then the building had felt different, tighter, louder, less patient. Holloway didn't look at Walter. He walked to the window and stared out at the city below, phone pressed to his ear. He spoke fast and low, the way men speak when they don't want to be overheard. "I moved it already," he said. "No, it doesn't show on the quarterly. That's the point." He paused, listening. "Because Hendricks doesn't know and he isn't going to. Just make sure the Morrison account reflects what we discussed and nothing else." He hung up. He turned, and he saw Walter. Not just noticed him, saw him. The way a man sees something that changes the temperature of a room. Walter had his back half turned, wiping the window near the far wall. His face was neutral. His hands kept moving, but the silence between them stretched 1 second too long. Holloway's expression didn't show anger. It showed calculation. "What are you doing in here?" he said. Walter stopped. "Third floor cleaning round, sir, same as every morning." Holloway's eyes stayed on him. "How long have you been in here?" Walter looked at him steadily. "About 20 minutes. Another pause. Holloway smiled, but it didn't reach anything. "I have calls starting at 8. I need this space cleared." "I'll be out of your way in a few minutes," Walter said. "Just finishing the far section." "No," Holloway crossed his arms. "You're done now." Walter looked at the far corner, a trash can still full, a streak on the window that needed attention. "Sir, I just need—" "I said you're done." Holloway's voice hardened. "This isn't a negotiation. Take your cart and go." Walter looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, gathered his supplies, and pushed the cart toward the door without another word. As he passed, Holloway spoke again, quieter this time but not quiet enough. "Should have been done before people arrived anyway." Walter didn't stop walking. He had heard worse. But he had also heard everything. By 9 o'clock, Caldwell Tower was fully alive. The lobby moved like a current, people in, people out, voices overlapping, phones lighting up, the revolving doors spinning without stopping. Walter worked the edges. The hallways, the stairwells, the service areas that nobody thought about until something went wrong. He was in the 4th-floor corridor when he heard his name. "Walter." It was Marcus, the building supervisor. A decent man, tired around the eyes, always carrying a clipboard he rarely looked at. "Come with me." Walter left his cart against the wall and followed. They took the elevator up to the 7th floor management level. The carpet was thicker here. The lights were warmer. The air smelled like the kind of coffee that cost more than Walter's lunch. Marcus stopped outside a door with frosted glass. "HR," he said, and something in his voice made Walter's chest tighten. "What's this about?" Marcus didn't answer. He just held the door open. Inside sat 3 people. A woman Walter recognized from HR. Her name was Patricia Cole, and she always smiled the same careful, practiced smile. Beside her sat the building manager, a heavy man named Gerald Ford. And at the head of the table, already leaning back with his arms crossed, was Derek Holloway. Walter sat down. Patricia Cole opened a folder. "Walter," she said, "we'll keep this direct. There have been concerns raised." Walter's hands rested flat on the table. "What kind of concerns?" Holloway answered before she could. "You were in the executive area this morning when you shouldn't have been." "I clean the 3rd floor every morning," Walter said. "That's my assignment." Gerald Ford cleared his throat. "There have also been other reports. staff feeling uncomfortable. Walter looked at him steadily. Uncomfortable how? You linger, Holloway said, the word landing like an accusation. People have said you make them feel watched. Walter's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. I've worked here 7 years. My job is to be thorough. Your job, Holloway said, sitting forward now, is to stay invisible. The room went quiet. Walter looked at Holloway, then at Ford, then at Patricia Cole, whose smile hadn't changed. I've never had a complaint in 7 years, Walter said. Patricia Cole tilted her head. We appreciate your service, Walter, truly. There it was, that word, appreciated, past tense wrapped in the present. Walter had heard it before in his life in other rooms from other people who were about to take something from him. You're not going to keep me, he said, not a question. Gerald Ford leaned back. It's a business decision. We're restructuring cleaning contracts. Outside firm coming in. It's nothing personal. Walter looked at the folder on the table. He didn't reach for it. Outside firm, he repeated. You'll receive 4 weeks severance, Patricia said, more than required. Holloway stood up like the meeting was already over. Security will walk you out. Standard procedure. Walter sat still for a moment. He felt the familiar heat behind his eyes, not grief, not anger, something older than both of those. The feeling of being measured and found unnecessary. He stood up slowly. His knees ached the way they always did now in the mornings. May I get my things? Security will assist you, Patricia said. 2 guards he had greeted by name for 3 years walked him to his locker. They didn't speak. He took his spare jacket, his lunch bag, a small photograph he kept taped inside the door. His daughter at a lake, laughing at something off camera. His son standing beside her, hand on her shoulder, smiling like a man who had never needed to make himself small. At the bottom of the locker, under a folded cloth, was a business card. Walter picked it up without thinking, the way you pick up something you've handled 1,000 times. It was heavy stock, matte black, with a single line of silver text. Thomas R. Gaines, Gaines Capital Group. No title, no phone number, just the name and the company, because Thomas had always said that people who needed to reach him already knew how. Walter slipped it into his jacket pocket and closed the locker for the last time. The guards walked him to the lobby. People were everywhere. Suits, conversations, the sounds of a building running at full speed. Walter carried his things in a plastic bag. He passed the front desk. The young woman there, her name was Brianna, looked up for a split second, then looked back at her screen. He pushed through the revolving doors. Outside, the city was bright and cold and indifferent. Taxis moved. Pigeons scattered. A man with a briefcase nearly walked into him and kept going without looking back. Walter stood on the steps of Caldwell Tower and breathed. Then he reached into his pocket and looked at his phone. 3 missed calls. All from the same contact. Thomas. His son. Walter stared at the name for a long moment. His thumb hovered over it. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and walked down the steps alone, the plastic bag in his hand, moving through the crowd the way he always had, quietly, carefully, like a man who had learned that stillness was its own kind of armor. He didn't know yet that armor sometimes looks like 4 black SUVs. Walter took the crosstown bus. He sat near the window and watched the buildings shrink as the city gave way to quieter streets. His hands were still in his lap. His face was still. The woman across from him was asleep. A teenager had headphones in and stared at the floor. Nobody noticed the old man in the faded jacket carrying a plastic bag. That was fine. He had spent his whole life being fine with that. The apartment was on the second floor of a brick building on Larimer Street. 3 rooms, good light in the mornings, a radiator that clanked in winter but worked. Walter had lived there for 11 years. Before that, a different life entirely, but Walter didn't think about before often because before had a way of making now feel strange. He unlocked the door and set the plastic bag on the kitchen table. The apartment smelled like the coffee he had made at 5 in the morning, now cold on the counter. He poured it out. He stood at the sink for a moment, looking out the small window at the alley below. A cat sat on a fire escape. A neighbor's radio played something he didn't recognize. Walter washed his hands. He dried them slowly. Then he sat at the table and opened the plastic bag and took out the photograph. He set it face up in the center of the table. Thomas was 34 in that photo. Miriam was 31. It had been taken 3 summers ago at a lake in Vermont. Miriam had insisted on the trip. She always insisted on the things that mattered. Thomas had driven. Walter had sat in the back seat the whole way up, watching trees through the window, letting his children believe he was just resting. He hadn't been resting. He had been grateful. More than they knew. His phone buzzed on the table. Thomas calling. Walter let it ring twice, then he picked up. "Hey, Dad." Thomas's voice was steady the way it always was. He had his mother's voice, warm underneath, careful on the surface. "Thomas." A pause. "You don't sound right." Walter almost smiled. His son had always been like that, noticing things without making a scene about it. "I'm fine." "You're not at work." Walter looked at the photograph. "No." Another pause longer. "What happened?" Walter set the photo down gently. "They let me go today." Silence on the line, then carefully, "Who did?" "Management. They're bringing in a new cleaning company. It's restructuring." Thomas said nothing for a moment. Walter could hear him breathing. Could hear, underneath the breathing, something tighter. "Dad," Thomas said, "was it Holloway?" Walter's eyes lifted. "How do you know that name?" "Because I know things," Thomas said quietly. "Because I pay attention. And because Miriam called me an hour ago." Walter's jaw tightened. "I didn't call Miriam." "I know you didn't." Thomas's voice stayed even. "That's the problem, Dad. That's always the problem." Walter rubbed the back of his neck. "This doesn't need to become something. It already is something." "Thomas." "Dad," and there it was, the shift in his son's voice. Not anger, something more controlled than anger, something that had been waiting. "You cleaned that building for 7 years. You showed up every day before the sun. You never complained once. And they walked you out like you were a problem they needed to remove." Walter's throat tightened. "It's done." "No," Thomas said, "it isn't." The line was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck passed on the street below. The cat on the fire escape hadn't moved. "Whatever you're thinking," Walter said, "don't." "I'm not thinking," Thomas replied. "I already decided." "Thomas, I don't want." "I know what you want, Dad." And his voice softened then just enough. "You want it to be quiet. You want to protect everyone. You want to disappear before anyone has to fight for you." A pause. "But I'm your son, and I won't let this be quiet." Walter closed his eyes. In the silence, he heard Miriam's voice from 3 years ago, standing at the edge of that lake in Vermont, watching the sun drop behind the tree line. "Daddy," she had said, "you have to stop acting like you don't deserve things." He had laughed at that. He wasn't laughing now. "What are you going to do?" Walter asked. Thomas's answer was simple. "I'm going to make sure they see you." The next morning, Caldwell Tower looked exactly like it always had. Glass clean, marble floors shining, the flag out front moving in the early wind, the revolving doors spinning, people arriving in good coats, carrying good bags, living lives that moved at a different speed than the rest of the city. Nobody mentioned Walter Gaines. Brianna at the front desk arrived with an iced coffee and her phone already buzzing. She glanced once toward the service hallway. The cart wasn't there, and for a half-second felt something wrong, the way you feel when a familiar sound stops. Then a call came in and the feeling disappeared. On the 11th floor, Derek Holloway stood at his window looking down at the street. His coffee was hot. His calendar was full. The day was moving the way he liked days to move, efficiently, without friction. Gerald Ford knocked and entered, meeting with the new contract firm at 10. Holloway nodded, good. Transition should be seamless. Ford set a folder on the desk. The old staff paperwork is processed. Clean exit. Holloway glanced at the folder. No noise. Ford shook his head. None, he signed everything. Holloway picked up his coffee. Good, that's how it should go. He turned back to the window. 11 floors below, on the street outside the building, a black SUV had turned the corner and slowed. Holloway didn't notice. Nobody inside the building did. Not yet. Down in the lobby, shortly after 9, the energy changed. It happened quietly, the way weather changes before a storm, a drop in pressure, a shift in the air that people feel before they understand it. Brianna looked up from her desk because she heard the engines first, not loud, just present, the kind of low, steady sound that doesn't belong on a normal morning. Through the glass walls she saw them. One black SUV at the curb, then another, then a third pulling in behind it, then a fourth positioning itself across the street with precision, engine running completely still. She stood up slowly. The vehicles didn't move. No one got out yet. They just sat there, dark, clean, deliberate, like they had been invited by someone more important than anyone in the building. A security guard named Ray walked over to the glass. "You expecting anyone?" Brianna shook her head. Ray keyed his radio. "Front desk. We've got 4 unidentified vehicles at the main entrance." "Anyone have eyes on authorization?" Static, no answer. People in the lobby had started to notice. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. A man in a gray suit paused near the elevators and stared. Then the first SUV's doors opened. 2 men stepped out, both in dark suits, both with earpieces visible. Their posture was the kind of posture that isn't learned in an office. It was trained somewhere else over a long time in conditions that didn't forgive mistakes. They moved to the entrance with calm, deliberate steps. The revolving doors slowed as they entered. Brianna felt the temperature in the lobby drop 2 degrees. She was certain of it. One of the men looked at her directly. "We're here to see Walter Gaines," he said. The name landed in the lobby like a stone dropped in still water. Brianna blinked. "Mr. Gaines doesn't, he no longer works here." The man nodded once. "We know." He looked around the lobby, not anxiously, assessingly, the way someone does when they're cataloging a room. "We'll wait." Ray stepped forward. "Sir, this is a private building, if you need to." The second man turned and looked at Ray. Ray stopped talking. Not because of anything threatening, because of something in the man's eyes that made arguments feel pointless. Upstairs, Holloway's assistant knocked and entered. "Mr. Holloway, there's a situation in the lobby." He turned from his window. "What kind of situation?" "I'm not sure." She hesitated. "You should come down." Holloway stepped out of the elevator into a lobby that felt nothing like the one he had left 20 minutes ago. He saw the two men standing near the center of the room. He saw the people giving them space, not because they were told to, but instinctively, the way crowds part for things they don't fully understand. He saw Ray standing off to the side, his hand near his radio but not touching it. Gerald Ford appeared beside Holloway. "What is this?" Holloway squared his shoulders and walked forward. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The first man looked at him. "Are you the decision maker here?" Holloway straightened. "I'm Chief Operations Officer Derek Holloway." The man didn't extend a hand. "We're waiting for someone." "Who authorized your presence here?" Holloway pressed. "We don't require authorization from this building," the man said. Holloway's face reddened. "Excuse me." The revolving doors turned again. Everyone looked. A woman walked in. She was in her early 30s, dark blazer, hair pulled back neatly, no jewelry except a small gold watch on her left wrist that caught the light once and didn't ask for attention again. She walked with the kind of quiet certainty that doesn't need speed, each step placed like she had already decided where she was going before she arrived. She scanned the lobby, then her eyes landed on Holloway. She walked directly to him. "You're Holloway," she said, "not a question." He blinked. "Yes, and you are?" "Miriam Gaines." She held his gaze without blinking. "Walter Gaines is my father." The air shifted. Brianna's hand went to her mouth. Gerald Ford stiffened. Holloway kept his expression neutral with visible effort. "Miss Gaines, I understand you may be upset." "I'm not upset," Miriam said. Her voice was even. "Upset is what you feel when your coffee is cold. What I am is here." Holloway tried again. "Your father's termination was handled according to—" "He was escorted out," Miriam said, "in front of colleagues who knew him, with a security guard on either side, after 7 years. She let that sit for a second. "You didn't fire an employee. You made a point." Holloway's jaw tightened. "We followed protocol." Miriam tilted her head slightly. "Does your protocol include having a senior executive tell a 63-year-old man that his job is to stay invisible?" The lobby was completely silent. Gerald Ford turned slowly toward Holloway. Holloway said nothing. "I thought so," Miriam said. She stepped back slightly and looked toward the glass doors. Outside, the SUVs hadn't moved. Then she spoke quietly to the man beside her. "Let him know we're here." The man nodded and raised his phone. Upstairs, Patricia Cole from HR had been watching from the mezzanine. She walked down now, hands clasped, professional smile deployed. "Miss Gaines, perhaps we could take this conversation somewhere more private." Miriam looked at her. "You made it public when you walked him out." Patricia's smile faltered. Holloway stepped forward, lowering his voice. "I don't know what you think this display accomplishes, but—" "It isn't a display," Miriam said. "My brother is on his way." Holloway paused. "Your brother?" "Yes." "And who exactly is your brother?" Miriam looked at him, the way someone looks at a question they've already answered. The revolving doors turned. A man entered. Thomas Gaines was 34 years old and had the kind of presence that didn't need announcement. He was tall, broader than Holloway, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and something underneath both that was entirely his own. He wore a dark coat over a suit, no tie, and he moved through the lobby with the quiet authority of someone who was used to rooms adjusting to him rather than the other way around. He stopped beside his sister. His eyes moved across the lobby slowly. The two men in suits, the executive standing stiff, Brianna frozen at her desk, the security guards who had walked his father out now standing very still. Then Thomas spoke. His voice was calm, unhurried. "My father gave 7 years to this building," he said. "He arrived before sunrise. He left after closing. He knew every person's name in this lobby and never once asked to be thanked." He paused. "Yesterday, you decided he wasn't worth keeping, and you made sure he knew it on the way out." Holloway straightened. "This is a personnel matter. It concerns me," Thomas said. Something in his tone made Holloway stop speaking. Gerald Ford leaned toward Holloway and whispered, "Who are these people?" Holloway shook his head slightly. Thomas reached into his coat and removed a slim envelope. He placed it on the reception desk without drama. "Open it," he said to Brianna. Brianna looked at Holloway. Holloway said nothing. She opened it. Her eyes moved across the document inside. Then she looked up and her face had changed entirely. This is a corporate registry." Gerald Ford stepped forward and took the paper from her. He read. His face went gray. Holloway grabbed it from him. His eyes moved fast across the page, then slower. Then he looked up at Thomas. "This isn't," he started. "It's public record," Thomas said. "You could have found it yourself." Miriam added quietly, "You didn't think to look." Holloway's hands had gone still around the paper. Gerald Ford stood beside him like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was thinner than he had thought. Patricia Cole's professional smile was gone entirely. The document was 3 pages: corporate registration, board affiliations, asset holdings across 4 states. The kind of paperwork that doesn't announce itself, it just sits in public records unread until someone has a reason to look. The name at the top was a holding company, Gaines Capital Group, founded 31 years ago. Primary stakeholders: Thomas R. Gaines, Miriam A. Gaines, and listed quietly near the bottom, the way a man like Walter would insist on, Walter J. Gaines, founder. Holloway's voice came out smaller than he intended. "Your father he owns." "He built it," Thomas said, "and then he stepped back because that's the kind of man he is." A pause. "He wanted to work with his hands for himself. That was his choice and we respected it." Something moved across Holloway's face, slow and cold and too late. He turned to Walter. "The card," he said quietly, "in your locker. I saw it once when the door was open. I thought it was nothing, a janitor with a fancy business card." He almost laughed when he said it, but the laugh didn't come. "I thought it was nothing." Walter met his eyes. "It was never nothing." Holloway's jaw tightened. "You knew. This whole time you had all of this behind you and you never said a word." Walter's voice was even. "I wasn't here to use it. I was here to work." The words settled over the room like the last piece of something that had always been there, waiting to be understood. Gerald Ford whispered, "Why would a man with..." He stopped himself. Miriam looked at him. "With what? With money, with influence." She let the words land. "Because work meant something to him. Because he believed in earning his place in a room without anyone knowing his name." The lobby had gone completely still. Somewhere behind the desk, Brianna had set down her iced coffee and hadn't touched it since. Holloway's voice was tight now. If we had known who he was. Stop, Thomas's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. That is exactly the wrong answer. You understand that, don't you? Holloway blinked. If you had known who he was, Thomas continued, you would have treated him differently. That's what you're saying. He let the silence stretch. You're saying the only reason a 63-year-old man deserves dignity is if he has money behind him. Nobody in the lobby moved. Ray, the security guard, the one who had walked Walter out the day before, looked down at the floor. Thomas watched him, then softer, you didn't know. You were doing what you were told. Ray looked up. He nodded once, something working in his jaw. Thomas turned back to Holloway. Holloway tried to recover. We can make this right. Full reinstatement, back pay, a formal. He doesn't want to come back, Miriam said. Holloway faltered. Then compensation, whatever number you think is fair. Miriam shook her head slowly, still wrong. What do you want? Gerald Ford said, his voice cracking slightly. Thomas answered, we want what you already took. His dignity in front of the people who watched it happen. He looked around the lobby deliberately. That doesn't have a number. Outside, the fourth SUV's door opened. A man got out, older, silver-haired, carrying a leather briefcase. He walked toward the entrance with the unhurried pace of someone who had been in rooms like this many times before and found them smaller each time. He came through the revolving doors and stopped beside Thomas. Mr. Holloway, the man said, my name is Richard Altman. I represent Gaines Capital Group. He opened his briefcase and removed a second document. This is a formal notice of complaint filed with the State Labor Board, citing wrongful termination, workplace harassment, and coerced signing of severance documents under duress. Patricia Cole made a sound that wasn't a word. Altman continued. Additionally, we've requested a review of this building's public contract status, given that 3 of its anchor tenants operate on city-funded agreements. Gerald Ford grabbed the wall. Holloway's face had gone pale. You can't. It's already filed, Altman said simply. He closed the briefcase. Miriam looked at Holloway one last time. Her voice dropped, not soft exactly, but honest. My father never asked for any of this. He asked us not to come. He told us it wasn't worth the trouble. She paused. He still thinks about other people before himself, even the people who hurt him. She held Holloway's gaze. That's the man you called invisible. Then she turned and spoke quietly into her phone. We're ready, bring him. Walter had been sitting at the kitchen table for the better part of the morning. He'd had 2 cups of coffee. He'd read the same page of a book 4 times without absorbing a word. He'd washed dishes that were already clean. He was not a man who sat still easily, but he didn't know what to do with himself when the thing that gave his morning's shape was suddenly gone. His phone had been quiet since Thomas called. He had asked them not to go. Thomas had said, I know, Dad, which was not the same as agreeing. Walter understood his children. He understood them the way parents understand things they can't say out loud, in their bones, in the particular way pride and worry sit next to each other until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Thomas had been 9 years old when he started asking careful questions, not loud ones. Just, why is that, Dad? How does that work? What would happen if? Walter had answered all of them. What he hadn't told Thomas, not until much later, was that half the reason he kept working after they didn't need the money anymore was because he was afraid of what silence would do to him. That he needed to feel useful in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. that mopping a floor correctly, at 5 in the morning, before anyone arrived, gave him something that board meetings never had. His phone buzzed. A text from Miriam. "Dad, we're at the building. Please come." Walter set the phone face down on the table. He sat for a long moment. Then he looked at the photograph again, the two of them at the lake, easy and laughing, not performing anything for anyone, just themselves, his children. He had spent 30 years making sure they never had to shrink themselves for anyone. He had spent 63 years doing exactly that himself. He turned the phone back over. He typed, "I'll come." He stood up, put on his jacket, the good one, the charcoal one Miriam had given him 2 Christmases ago that he barely wore because it felt like too much, and he walked out the door. He took the bus. Of course he took the bus. He sat near the window and watched the city come back into focus. The quieter streets giving way to taller buildings, the sky between them narrowing. He held his hands in his lap and kept his breathing slow the way he had learned to do when things were harder than he let on. At the stop 2 blocks from Caldwell Tower, he got off. He stood on the sidewalk and looked down the street. He could see the SUVs from here. 4 of them, dark and still, arranged with a precision that had nothing accidental about it. People on the sidewalk slowed when they passed them, not afraid, just aware that something different was happening. Walter breathed in once. Then he walked. He didn't hurry. He passed a bakery he had gone to once or twice, a dry cleaner, a coffee cart where the man had sometimes waved at him in the mornings. The man was there now, and he watched Walter pass with a look that said he didn't understand what was happening but sensed it mattered. Walter reached the steps of Caldwell Tower. Through the glass he could see people, his children, the executives, faces turned toward the door. He pushed through the revolving doors. The lobby went quiet the moment he entered. Not because he was loud, because he wasn't. Walter Gaines walked in wearing a charcoal jacket and clean shoes, carrying nothing, and the room felt the weight of his quiet like a bell that had been struck. Miriam reached him first. She crossed the lobby quickly and stopped in front of him, and for a moment she just looked at him, really looked, the way children look at parents when they're measuring them against something important. "Dad," she said. "Miriam." His voice was even, but his eyes were full. She put her hand on his arm. "You came. You asked me to." Thomas appeared beside them. He didn't speak for a moment. He just stood there, shoulder almost touching his father's, and the 3 of them formed something in the center of the lobby that nobody who was watching would forget. Then Thomas looked at Holloway. "This is my father," he said, simply, finally. Holloway stood across the marble floor, the document still in his hands, and he looked at Walter Gaines, really looked, maybe for the first time, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite fear but lived somewhere between them. Walter looked back at him. He didn't look away. He didn't make himself small. For the first time in 7 years inside this building, Walter Gaines stood exactly as tall as he was. Holloway opened his mouth. Walter raised one hand, just slightly, just enough. Holloway stopped. Walter walked toward him slowly. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at the man who had told him his job was to stay invisible, the man who had smirked when security walked him out, the man who had assumed that quiet meant empty. He looked at him for a long time. Then Walter said, "I don't need an apology." Holloway blinked. "I've had apologies before," Walter continued. "Words are easy, especially after consequences arrive. He glanced briefly toward Richard Altman. I'm not here for your words. Gerald Ford cleared his throat. Then what? I'm here, Walter said, because my children asked me to be. He turned slightly toward Thomas and Miriam, and because they deserve to see this. He looked back at Holloway. Not for me. For them. So they know that what was done to their father has a name, and that name was said out loud in the place where it happened. The lobby held its breath. Ray, the security guard, pressed his hand flat against the desk and stared at the floor. Brianna hadn't looked at her phone in 11 minutes. Patricia Cole had set her tablet down and simply stood. Walter looked at them, the guards, the desk staff, the employees who had watched him work for 7 years and never asked his name. I don't blame most of you, he said quietly. You were busy. That's how it goes. He paused. But if you walk past someone tomorrow and they're doing a job that keeps your building running, maybe take a second. Nobody spoke. Nobody tried to. Thomas placed a hand lightly on his father's shoulder. Walter didn't move away from it. That, more than anything, was what broke something in the room. Richard Altman stepped forward. The formal complaints stand regardless of today's conversation. That process will proceed. He looked at Holloway and Ford. I'd suggest your legal team make contact by end of week. Holloway nodded, once, mechanically, like a man who had forgotten what he was nodding at. Miriam stepped close to her father, ready. Walter looked around the lobby one final time. He looked at the floors he had cleaned 1,000 mornings, the glass he had kept clear, the corners nobody noticed unless they were wrong. He nodded. They walked out together. The doors opened. The SUVs were still there. One door was held open by a man whose posture alone spoke a language Holloway was only beginning to understand. Walter got in. The door closed. Through the tinted glass, the last thing Walter saw was Holloway, standing at the top of the steps, one hand in his pocket, watching the car pull away. He didn't look powerful anymore. He looked like a man who had just learned the difference between authority and respect, and found out too late that he only ever had one of them. The SUV merged into traffic. Walter sat back. Miriam reached over and put her hand on his. He looked out the window at the city moving past. You didn't have to, he said quietly. We know, she replied. Thomas glanced back from the front seat. That's why we did. Walter looked at his hands, then at the window, then somewhere farther than both. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself be carried. Walter did not move to a mansion. He stayed on Larimer Street. He repainted the kitchen the following Saturday, a soft gray that Miriam had picked out and he had agreed to because it reminded him of overcast mornings, the kind he had always liked. He fixed the window latch that had been loose for 2 years. He planted something in a pot by the sill, small and green and slow growing, which suited him fine. He began volunteering 3 mornings a week at a community center 6 blocks away. Maintenance work, cleaning, small repairs, the kind of things that hold a place together without announcement. The people there learned his name in 3 days. Not because he told them, because he was consistent, because he showed up, because when something was broken, he fixed it, and when something was done, he moved to the next thing without waiting to be noticed. That was Walter. That had always been Walter. The labor board complaint moved through its process. Holloway resigned before it concluded. a decision his lawyers called voluntary and everyone else understood differently. Gerald Ford took a leave of absence that became permanent. Patricia Cole issued a written statement acknowledging the termination had been mishandled. None of them called Walter directly. He didn't wait for them to. Thomas visited on a Sunday in early November, and they sat at the small table with coffee and the window open a crack, even though it was cold. "You're not angry," Thomas said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation the way Thomas had always made observations. Walter thought about it. "I was," he said, "for about a day and a half." Thomas smiled. "What happened after that?" Walter looked at his coffee. "I remembered that angry men don't sleep, and I like sleeping." Thomas laughed, really laughed. Walter smiled. Miriam called twice a week, once on Wednesday evenings, once on Sunday mornings. She never asked if he needed anything because she had learned years ago that he would say no regardless. Instead, she told him things, work things, small stories from her week, the way adults talk to parents when they want connection more than advice. Walter listened carefully. He always had. One morning in December, he walked past Caldwell Tower again. He hadn't planned to. It was just on the way to a hardware store he liked. He slowed when he reached the steps. The revolving doors were spinning. People were coming and going in good coats. The flag was moving in the cold wind. A young man in a janitor's uniform was wiping the outside of the glass near the entrance. New guy. Young. Maybe 25, maybe younger. He worked carefully, the way someone works when they're new enough to still take pride in the details. He didn't look up as people passed. Walter watched him for a moment. Then he walked over. The young man looked up, startled. Walter smiled. "You're missing the lower left corner," he said, not unkindly. "Gets steamed up from the heating vents in winter. Fog's over." The young man blinked, then looked at the corner, then nodded, "Thanks." Walter nodded back. He started to walk on. "Hey," the young man said. Walter turned. "You know this building." Walter looked at the glass, at the lobby behind it, at the marble floors that held 7 years of mornings he had given without condition. "I used to work here," he said. The young man studied him for a second. Then he said, "They treating you right in there." Walter almost smiled. "They are now," he said. And he walked on. "Let me ask you something before you go. Have you ever walked past someone doing a quiet job, cleaning, maintaining, fixing, and not said a word? Not because you were cruel, just because you were busy, because they blended into the background of your day?" Most of us have. Walter Gaines never asked for recognition. He didn't want celebration or status or the kind of attention that follows power when it walks into a room. He wanted to work, to be useful, to show up. And a building full of people who should have known better mistook that for weakness. They found out what most people find out too late. That quiet isn't the same as empty. That dignity doesn't require an audience to be real. That the people who never make themselves the center of the room are sometimes holding everything together from the edges. Walter didn't win because of the SUVs. He didn't win because of the documents or the lawyers or the moment Holloway's face changed. He won years before any of that, the morning he decided that his work mattered regardless of who was watching. Everything else was just the world catching up. If this story stayed with you, don't just scroll past it, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And next time you walk past someone doing the quiet work, take a second, because respect doesn't cost anything, And sometimes it means everything. And if you want more stories like this, you can subscribe. There's more coming.